You may or may not have seen around and about on the internet a variety of political quizzes. They range from the well-known political compass quiz to some of the more recently popular ones, such as the 8 values test, how communist are you, and how fascist are you. I've even seen in recent times these tests and the results that people get from them being used as online proofs of certain positions that people hold. While these tests are fun and ultimately harmless, they should absolutely not be used to prove a political position or orientation in any capacity at all. Certainly not as a substitute or shorthand for an actual in-depth discussion about a topic and someone's thoughts, beliefs, and evidence for those positions. Sure, it can be fun when some wingnut progressive screeches "fascist" at you to whip out a quick internet test and point out that it supposedly, objectively, proves that you are not one, but the notion that these tests are reliable in any capacity is flawed. So let's have a consideration as to why. The answer is quite simple. Many of these tests rely on broad, poorly defined, poorly worded questions, many of which have questionably operationalized variables based on the weighting of your answers. For instance, take the point, "I believe the existence of the state is a necessary thing," and then you rank your agreement with that statement. Now the problem is this is poorly defined. For instance, the only people who will really disagree with this statement outright are the various flavors of anarchism, be they far-left anarcho-communist types, or other schools which are often denied by classical anarchists such as anarcho-capitalism. Even various forms of libertarianism such as minarchists, people who support a small state, would have to answer in the positive to this question. However, so does pretty much every other political orientation. Communists, for instance, support the absolute authority of the state to handle the forceful redistribution of wealth and/or goods from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat, as well as the state ownership of the means of production as a means of keeping it out of the hands of the oppressive capitalist class. Fascists also believe in the authority of the state, often under a single-person leadership, this person having absolute authority for a life sentence that defines the direction of the entire nation and its people. This mantle may be elected. Yes, democratic fascism is a thing, even though it may sound oxymoronic. It's merely an election that may be carried out by the populace or by a small group of leaders to pass the mantle of leadership to one leader who will often hold this mantle of power for the entirety of their life, and then it is passed to the next candidate. In non-democratic fascist nations, this mantle is often conferred by heredity or by appointment from the leadership position. Classical liberals, too, generally believe that the existence of the state is a good thing. It provides them with the legal system they prefer and the varying degrees of democratic freedoms they support in the forms of ever-changing governments dictated by popular votes every so many years. It also provides the framework for the institutions that typify a liberal society, such as the legal system and varying degrees of socialized public systems, such as police force, fire service, healthcare if applicable, road maintenance, etc. These institutes can also be found in the other aforementioned political systems, it's just that their methods of existence and maintenance tend to be a bit different. So in this political quiz of all-knowing, look at me, this is totes what I am in a completely accurate and objective manner honest gov, we've now scored 1 point across fascism, communism, and liberalism, all ideas which are basically completely opposed to each other on base fundamental levels. Sticking with the topic of social institutions in society, let's take a more nebulous one that's open to all manner of interpretation. People have a right to healthcare. Rank your amount of agreement. Well, damn son, this one comes down entirely to how you interpret it, which will probably change from day to day based entirely upon your mood. Do you interpret this as saying society should have some mechanism for healthcare, and then amend it to in the form of private healthcare, or in the form of public healthcare? Do you interpret it as healthcare is a basic fundamental human right? Again, going to the far ends of the spectrum, under communism it can be argued that healthcare is a necessity that must be state-controlled, because you don't want oppressive capitalists exploiting the proletariat by charging them for healthcare. There's also the argument that the body is partly a means of production and as such must be cared for by duty of the state. Even under communism, there is still further the argument that healthcare should be considered private charity or a cooperative venture, and as such require no state intervention at all. This could work under both a totalitarian communist government and an anarcho-communist framework. As an example, in the Soviet Union there was the People's Commissariat for Health, an all-union level institute under the direction of a commissar nominated by the chairman of the Council of Ministers. This institute controlled all financial functions regarding health and the well-being of the population. This was the system put in place by the Bolsheviks that replaced a more free market-style system that previously existed. It resulted in largely cut wages for almost all medical staff because their budget was determined entirely by the state and not by how much they could make themselves. Unionization effectively made the firing of incompetent or corrupt people almost impossible, and this resulted in a massive drop in healthcare for everyone in the state outside of the rich who could basically bribe their way into better healthcare. Under fascism, similar cases can be made. The people have a duty to the state and the state to the people, while under the absolute authority of a governing body to determine the best direction for society. That same governing body must ensure the health and well-being of its citizenry so they can serve as appropriate. In the same way that current militaries have their own healthcare separate from civilian healthcare, this model can be expanded out to every domain under the control of the absolute authority of the state. This is, for example, why under fascist rule in Nazi Germany, there were government credits given to workers who were forced to pay health insurance that could be redeemed for healthcare and holiday times only. It was a reflection of the state repaying its citizens for their duty in a manner that would improve their productivity. It was a system that was inherited from the previous era and left mostly unchanged for the average person, the only difference being that healthcare and insurance answered to the state, not to private entities. Rather interestingly, it was basically the forerunner of modern mixed economy universal healthcare that we know today, with publicly run hospitals and clinics in existence supplemented by privately owned ones answerable to the state. The main problem, of course, being in Nazi Germany that this system was often used by the state to provide multiple-tier healthcare to different classes of people based on racial characteristics. Under modern classical liberalism, the system is largely similar to the previous, varying by nation from fully private healthcare with internal checks and balances to fully public healthcare provided for and answerable to the state, and any and everything in between. Once again, we find ourselves in the position that this political orientation quiz can mark you down for points, positive or negative, across vastly different political ideologies based on the nebulous nature and potential interpretations of the question asked. Then there is of course the fact that many of these political alignment systems are inherently flawed in how they display data, taking into account only quantitative information and displaying nothing of the qualitative side of the data. So let's take an example of a hypothetical left-right design, a vastly reductionist to the point of almost being useless method of working out where people are politically, but it is the most widely used terminology. Let's say there are two people in the middle. One has arrived there because their position on religion and tradition is that they are important cornerstones of society, a traditionally right-leaning answer. This same person is also in favour of removing the state as an entity in its entirety and letting people govern themselves as they see fit, with no central authority in the form of anarchism, a traditionally left-leaning position. These two answers combined together into a single data point lands the person in the middle. Another person states that religion and tradition is unimportant and should be abandoned in favour of secularism, a more traditionally left-leaning position. They also believe that the state should be expanded and take an active role in the lives of its people, and it should probably have mandatory control over large swathes of the socio-economic landscape, a position of totalitarianism traditionally associated with the political right. These two answers, when combined into a single data point, once again lands the person somewhere in the middle. so two people occupying the same space hold vastly different views from each other. There have been attempts by some to add an additional north-south divide to the reductive left-right false dichotomy, which takes into account the variables of authoritarianism and libertarianism. This allows for the acknowledgement of people on the right who favour small government and personal freedom without falsely lumping them in with people on the left they disagree with. It also allows for authoritarians on the left who want big government control without falsely associating them with the reductive idea that only people on the right can be inclined to big government control. However, this extra dimension, while freeing the left-right divide of some of its reductive and misleading generalizations, also has limitations in precisely the same manner. It's just on two axes rather than on one. People who score vastly differently in different categories of answer can and will find themselves occupying the same space because of average numbers produced by all of their answers being reduced down to a single data point. These points are not to totally disregard these political compass style tests. They can be fun to do. They can make you think a little bit more about politics and what's important to you. However, to take their answers as anything other than something done more for the fun of just filling out a quiz is downright silly. Treat them as the fun, time-wasting activity that they are, not as some be-all, end-all proof of political allegiance or orientation.